I hit that thing.
Oh,
All right. We are live streaming. So I'm going to hit record and then we will get going. Welcome back to Beyond Sunday School. We are glad you are with us this week. As always, we are live streaming from the Zoom room here on Thursday afternoons at 1:00. We are continuing our conversation, our look, our study, our deep dive into the resurrection that we've called "What's Up with Resurrection?" And so we have looked at the Greek and Roman understanding of life after death. We've looked at biblical Judaism's perspective on life after death last week. This week, we are going to take a look at some of the ideas that were floating around post-biblical Judaism. So we're going to look at about a 400-year period, 200 BC to 200 AD, and take a look at some of the ideas that were floating around there. And we're doing this work over these last 3 weeks because this helps us to understand the cultural and literary and conceptual frameworks that the New Testament authors were aware of, were thinking through, were just kind of in the midst of, right? And so when they start talking about Jesus's resurrection, when Paul writes about Jesus's resurrection in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, there's a context, and we need to try to understand the context. We need to try to understand it historically, literarily, theologically, philosophically, all these things. And that's kind of the purpose of Beyond Sunday Schools, is we want to just do a little bit of a dive into some of the deeper things that are out there, some of the scholarship and research that's been done over the years on some of these issues, because we can do the Sunday school thing where we talk about these things on a maybe an inch deep level or 6-inch deep level. But here at Beyond Sunday School, what we try to do is go to that 100-foot level of depth, and we try to kind of get below things and try to think about these things in some different ways. And what this does is it helps us to more clearly understand what we read in the scriptures. And this is really important, because if we want to try to wrap our minds around the scriptures, then we need to have this understanding of what is happening in the culture and where these people were coming from. Because so often when we read the scriptures, we are getting one side of the story. We are getting oftentimes we are reading somebody else's mail, and so when you only get one side of a conversation, it can be hard to understand things. It can be hard to piece these ideas together. And so by understanding the cultural, historical, philosophical things that are floating around in the air and in the mindset of the first century, then we are able to have a more clear understanding of what is in the scriptures, which I think, as we do, draws us closer to the God who loves us, this faithful covenant God who cares for us, who loves us, and who wants us to know him personally, and wants us to be in relationship with him and with one another. And so we are using N.T. Wright and Michael Bird's New Testament survey. It's called The New Testament in Its World, An Introduction to the History, Literature, and Theology of the First Christians. So if you want to follow along in the text, you can grab that from Amazon or anywhere that you buy books. It's a little bit expensive, but I think it's well worth it. It's one of the better books that I have on my shelf, and it is very, very helpful for answering questions and trying to get some of this background information. You can be studying any book of the Bible, just about, any book of the New Testament, and you can open this and dig into some of the historical context that surrounds those particular letters or books. And so I think this is a well worth the investment. So like I said, this week we are going to be looking at post-biblical Judaism. So what does that mean? Well, when the Old Testament ends, right? So when Malachi is written, the last Italian prophet, he finishes his book of prophecy. The Old Testament canon was closed. Now, does that mean that the Jewish people stopped writing? Does that mean the Jewish people stopped thinking and processing and philosophizing and theologizing about God? No, not at all. They were prolific. They were wise. They were intelligent. They were wrestling with who the God of the universe is. They were wrestling with their covenant God. They were wrestling with these questions about how does God set things right in the face of this world within which we find ourselves that seems to be so wrong, right? Where there's so much oppression, so much hurt, so much pain, and especially those post-exilic Jews that had moved back, and things just were not as they felt like they should be. They never returned back to a time where they were not under the oppression of some outside force. And so as a result of that, they, by and large, the understanding is that they were still under exile. They were still waiting. They to this day are still waiting for God to bring them out of exile, for the covenant God to make good on the promises that God made in the Old Testament, and to set things right. And so this is what they're looking for. This is what they're wrestling with as they write and think and process during that time between Malachi and the coming of Jesus. Now, for us Christians, we of course think that the New Testament is a second part of the biblical canon, and so we see this time between Malachi and Matthew, or Malachi and Mark, really. Now, Mark was probably the earliest gospel, but we see this period of time in here as a time of a little bit of a time of mystery, a little bit of a time of silence, is how some people call it, because there were no scriptures written, but there were some very important religious, theological texts being written by these Jewish men and women as they were struggling in their relationships with God. So how do we think about this? What do we learn about life after death between the testaments? Well, it turns out that this Second Temple period, this time between the testaments, is not some clean cut, very easy time to kind of pick and see some clear streams of thoughts. No, this was a messy time. This was a time of invention. It was a time of a lot of kind of novel ways of thinking about things. The way that Wright and Bird put this is, they say, if the Old Testament offers a spectrum of belief about life after death, the Second Temple period provides something more like an artist's palette. Dozens of options with different ways of describing similar positions and similar ways of describing different ones. So they kind of go on to say that basically you can find almost as many different ideas about the afterlife as there were people. And so, which shouldn't surprise us, right? I mean, if you walk into any church today, You walk into any Christian church and you ask people about the afterlife and what it's going to be like and what's going to happen, you are going to find about as many different ideas about the afterlife as you're going to find church members. Sure, there might be some common threads and some common themes running through there, but how those common threads and how those common themes play out is going to be very, very scattered and widespread. And so this is kind of what we see in that Second Temple period, in this post-biblical period between 200 BC and 200 AD. We see a lot of different ideas. And yet in those, we are able to pull together a few threads and that seem to be a little bit more clear, that seem to be a bit more glaring. Now, the first thread is what we might call a pessimistic thread, the pessimistic understanding of what happens after you die. And that it, by and large, is credited to the Sadducees, right? Now, the Sadducees show up in the Gospels. The Sadducees were the religious leaders that were a little bit more inclined to work with the Romans. They were the ones that saw that there was an avenue towards power by working together with Rome, as opposed to working against Rome like the Pharisees did. And so these Sadducees, by and large, were aristocrats. They were, by and large, somewhat wealthy. They were, by and large, pretty happy with the way life worked. And so this sect traditionally is understood as to having denied the resurrection, saying that there was no resurrection. And not only that, but they seem to hold to an idea that when you die, you die. That there simply was nothing that happens after death. Now, there's a writing, a document that is out there. It's called Ecclesiasticus, and this is also known as the Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach. And so this was a little something that was floating around, and this is how he describes what happens when you die. It says, "Remember that death does not tarry, and the decree of Hades has not been shown to you. Do good to friends before you die. Reach out and give to them as much as you can. Do not deprive yourself of a day's enjoyment. Do not let your share of desired good pass by you. Will you not leave the fruit of your labors to another? And what you acquired by toil to be divided by lot? Give and take and indulge yourself, because in Hades, one cannot look for luxury. All living beings become old like a garment. For the decree from old is you must die." So in other words, go live your best life. Right? Love people, be kind to people, but indulge, enjoy, go out and eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die. This is basically the position of Ecclesiasticus. And so, this there's just not a lot of hope here in the sense of there being life after death. You just die. In the funeral inscription for a diaspora Jew named Jesus ben Famous, this guy was from Egypt. And he strikes kind of a similar note here. Listen to this. Now, as you listen to this, try to compare this in your mind to what Jesus of Nazareth might say, right? So this is the inscription for Jesus ben Famous. It says, "Traveler, my name is Jesus, and my father's name is Famous. When descending into Hades, I was 60 years of age. All of you should weep together for this man, who went at once at the hiding place of ages to abide there in the dark. Will you also bewail me, dear Dositheos, because you are in need of shedding bitter tears upon my tomb? When I died, I had no offspring. You will be my child instead. All of you, therefore, bewail me, Jesus, the unhappy man. That is not exactly, that's very different, right? From the Jesus that we might, that we know of in the New Testament, the Jesus of Nazareth. This is Jesus of Egypt, basically. And, he descends into Hades. And again, Hades is, it's Sheol. It's the place of the dead, the place of shadows, the dark place. And like we talked about last week and the week before, the idea here is that there just isn't really anything there. And it's just darkness and nothingness. And so this is not an optimistic view. This is a very pessimistic view. All you have is this life, and there is nothing more. And so while we should do good to our neighbors, says Ecclesiasticus, while we should try to do good, give as much as we can, we should also fully indulge ourselves in all that life has, because tomorrow we die. So this was basically the position of the Sadducees. Now, can we be 100% certain that this is their position? No, because we don't really have necessarily anything that we can pinpoint as saying, well, this guy was definitely a Sadducee. Most of what we know about the Sadducean sect is what we see in the New Testament, and it's also what we see in some of the Pharisees' writings about the Sadducees, guys like Josephus, for instance. So this was kind of their position. Now, the question that we need to wrestle with, and I think that Bird and Wright do a great job of raising here, is why. If you're serious about studying Torah, we looked at the Old Testament last week. While there were options, while there's a variety of perspectives on life after death in the Old Testament, and while you could embrace this kind of death into nothingness, there's also plenty of scripture, plenty of Old Testament scripture that points towards either immortality of the soul, or even better yet, a bodily resurrection, right? That where we left it last week in Daniel. I mean, you don't get much more clear of a bodily resurrection than we see in Daniel and in places in Isaiah. And so why would anybody want to embrace this idea over the concept of a bodily resurrection? And Wright and Bird make the argument, and I think it's a pretty good one, that resurrection was a revolutionary concept. And they don't mean revolutionary in the sense that it's new. They mean revolutionary in the sense that it turns things upside down. So their argument is that the Sadducees, the aristocracy, didn't want to embrace resurrection because they liked things as it was. Whereas those who were embracing the idea of resurrection, they were looking towards God in his faithful covenant, in his covenant faithfulness to set things right, to find justice. So in this, like we talked about last week, the resurrection, the idea of resurrection theologically is rooted in the identity of who God is, which as a result turns all of this upside down for the people. And so it kind of turns the world's structures upside down. In the resurrection, those who were oppressors are judged. Those who might have had worldly wealth and success get kind of flipped upside down if they were unloving, uncaring, if they were successful through ill-gotten gains. What we see is a judgment that comes on those who who did unjust things to find material happiness and comfort in this world. And so, if you were kind of on that top end of the social ladder, then you might not necessarily like that. You might not like the idea of it's, harder for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to go through an eye of a needle, right? You might not think that is such a good idea. You might really think that it would be better, we'd be better served to live life this way, where we are trying to give and trying to help people as best we can, but we're also trying to fully indulge and trying to get as much as we can on this side of life, because tomorrow we die. You see, so their position on life after death, on what happens when you die, might have been a bit more rooted in their sociological position, for a sociological reason, than for a theological reason. And I think that's interesting when we start considering this idea of resurrection flipping hierarchies of authority on end, and kind of flipping them upside down and changing them. And and we see that in places like Daniel 12, right, where people are martyred, and through their martyrdom, they find resurrection, and they find justice in the resurrection. The Wright and Bird summarize it this way on page 288. They say, thus, for those on top of the social pile, whether in Jerusalem or in Corinth, resurrection beliefs might be seen to threaten their established position. People who believe that their God is about to make a new world, and that those who die in loyalty to him will rise again to share gloriously in the rule of that world, are far more likely to lose respect for a wealthy aristocracy than people who think that this life, this world, and this age are the only ones there ever will be. And I think that's winsome, and I think that's an idea that holds some water. We see that in all kinds of things in our day and age, don't we? Where people don't want there to be change, because if there's change, then they lose power, they lose authority, they lose the position that they have. So I think there's a good argument there. So that's the Sadducean or pessimistic view, we might call it. Now, another big stream in post-biblical Judaism is what we might call the Platonic idea, or the Platonic stream. This idea of what happens after you die, that's rooted in Plato. We forget that Plato's influence extended well beyond Greece. Plato's influence, especially at this time, was rising again. So the educated, the scholarly class, they were reading Plato. They were thinking about Plato. Plato was influencing, the culture at the time in deep and very real ways, which is why we see echoes of Platonism throughout the New Testament. We see Paul, building on Platonic ideas, because, these were the ideas of the time. And so here in post-biblical Judaism, we shouldn't be surprised to see Platonic ideas show up here either. And the way we see this rooted is in what we might call the immortality of the soul, right? So remember, Plato held to this idea of forms, right? This idea that there were, that we look around the world and we see something like, we see all these different chairs, but there exists somewhere out of time the perfect chair, the form of the chair is what he called it, upon which all other chairs are based, but none of the other chairs that are in existence are the form. And so he connects that then to the idea of the soul, that our souls are immortal, and they are kind of imprisoned here in our bodies. And so when we die, our souls are released, and our immortal souls finally can return back to the place of the forms, back to the place of perfection. And then that gets developed into things like, a Greek reincarnation and different things that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And if you want to learn more about that, I'd encourage you to head back to this season's premiere episode. So we see in the first century a Jewish philosopher named Philo. He was he lived in Alexandria, and he's a really deep, good writer. If you want to do a deep dive into Jewish thought in those early kind of beginning of the millennium, the first millennium, I would encourage you to spend some time reading Philo. And so he taught very clearly the immortality of the soul as opposed to a bodily resurrection. And so he understood this very similarly to Plato, is that when somebody dies, their soul is released from their bodily prison. And so, but the key thing, the important thing that he adds on is they need to have remained pure from sensual defilement, right? That his argument was that if you lived a good and honorable life, a life that was pure and undefiled, then your soul would be released, and you would be able to follow the road of the patriarchs and the angels. So this is what he argues for. Josephus similarly argues for an immortality of the soul. Now, there's some question here as to what it exactly was that Josephus was arguing for, because as he wrote, his writing was done in such a way that he was trying to make the Jewish faith a little bit more palatable to Rome. And so there's some thought that he watered down his positions, that he, kind of presented them in a way that would just make Romans more comfortable. So we have to be a little bit careful about hanging too much authority on Josephus's arguments, but he describes the Pharisees as the Pharisaic sect as holding on to an idea of reincarnation, more so reincarnation, the immortality of the soul, more so than this idea of bodily resurrection, which is interesting because when you read through the New Testament, when you read through the Gospels, right, the Pharisees hold to resurrection in the Gospels. Jesus finds common ground with them on this issue of the resurrection. So that's an interesting take by Josephus, saying that the Pharisees actually held the reincarnation / immortality of the soul kind of position, which really does make people think that maybe he was just trying to fit these more into Hellenistic categories, because as we saw, there was no category for bodily resurrection in the Greek and Roman way of thinking. So in another Pharisaical work, another work that's kind of connected to the Pharisees, but in this Platonic kind of way of thinking, is called pseudo folklides. Wow. Or Phosilides. I don't know. Pseudo Phosilides. We'll go with that. And so he here lays out this idea of the immortality of the soul. He says, "For the souls remain unharmed among the deceased, for the spirit is alone of God to mortals and his image. For we have a body out of earth, and when afterward we are resolved again into earth, we are but dust. And then the air has received our spirit. All alike are corpses, but God rules over the souls. Hades is our common eternal home and fatherland, a common place for all, poor and kings. We humans live not a long time, but for a season. But our soul is immortal and lives ageless forever." So his understanding here is that there is this place of death where souls go and live in immortality. it sounds like there's some sense of identity here, that these souls carry out the image of God. But again, they're in this place of death in Hades. And God is reigning over them there in Hades. So he has this a little bit developed idea of what Hades is like. And so remember, this word Hades just means place of death. Too often in our Western and American kind of way of thinking about things, we think about Hades as being hell, place of the damned. And that is not the idea that we see in Greek and Roman literature. It's not really the idea that we necessarily see in the Old Testament. It is just simply the place of the dead. And here, God is clearly overseeing the immortal souls in Hades. And so that's another way that they were thinking about it. Now, so if we've got a pessimistic view, if we've got this Platonic view of immortal souls, so we have, for tomorrow we die, the pessimism. We have Platonic, which is the idea of the immortality of the soul. The third mainstream that is flowing through post-biblical Judaism is the idea of bodily resurrection. It's like they pick right up. We shouldn't be surprised by this, but they pick right up from the end of Daniel. They pick right up in these later writings, and we see this most clearly in places like the Maccabees, the second book of Maccabees, for instance. We have a clear promise of resurrection, of new bodily life, and it is rooted in the identity of who God is. That God, in the face of tragic oppression, of injustice, will set things right at some point. That there will come a climax in history where God is going to set things right. And as a result, there will be this new heavens, new earth, this new creation where justice reigns, where the people who died unjustly, where the people who were overwhelmed by oppression, by pain, by hurt, by sorrow, by this broken world, will now find joy and happiness and life and love. And it will be bodily. It will be real. It will be a new creation that is reigned over by the covenantly faithful God, right? This is the hope. This is the thing that we begin to see here. And so there is this narrative that we find in Second Maccabees as the people are standing up against and fighting against the Syrian tyrant Antiochus Epiphanes, right? This evil king. And there's the story that sounds very similar to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three in Daniel who would not bow their knee to Nebuchadnezzar, right? They would not bow their knee to the giant chocolate bunny, if we all remember our Veggie Tales. So these three did not bend their knee. And then you had Daniel, who would not eat the king's food, but ate only water and vegetables. And so once again, we see this similar story. And here you have a Judean mother and her 7 sons. And these 7 sons refuse to eat unclean foods, holding fast to the law of God, holding fast to eating the food that is considered ritually clean, that we might in modern, in our current parlance, we call it kosher, right? And so you have these brothers, and you have these sayings of these brothers, and it goes like this. The second brother says, "You accursed wretch, you dismiss us from this present life, but the King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life, because we have died for his laws." The third brother, he says this, put out his tongue and courageously stretched forth his hands and said nobly, "I got these from heaven, and because of his laws, I disdain them. And from him, I hope to get them back again." Again, bodily resurrection, bodily resurrection. The fourth brother, near death, said, "One cannot but choose to die at the hands of mortals. and to cherish the hope God gives of being raised again by him. But for you, there will be no resurrection to life. So he's again, they're speaking out to the evil king, and he says, listen, I'm holding on to the hope of being bodily raised, but you unjust king, you don't have that hope. The mother says she encouraged each of them in the language of their ancestors, filled with a noble spirit. She said, I do not know how you came into being in my womb. It was not I who gave you life and breath, nor I who set in order the elements within each of you. Therefore, the creator of the world, who shaped the beginning of humankind and devised the origin of all things, will in his mercy give life and breath back to you again, since you now forget yourselves for the sake of his laws. Right? So because of who God is in his covenant faithfulness to these 7 sons who are giving their lives for his laws, these martyrs, the hope is clear in Maccabees that they will not just have life eternal, but they will have bodily resurrection, that they will get all of their life back. Then it says, and this is the last quote from this section, 2 Maccabees chapter 7. Well, we have 2 more quotes, sorry. The mother to her youngest son, I beg you, my child, to look at the heaven and the earth and see everything that is in them, and recognize that God did not make them out of things that existed. And in the same way, the human race came into being. Do not fear this butcher, but prove worthy of your brothers, accept death, so that in God's mercy I may get you back again along with all your brothers. Her hope was not that they would necessarily, not that they're going to show up right here and now, but the hope is for the resurrection. The hope is that she will see them and that they will bodily rise again when in the recreation of the new of all things. The youngest son, here's the final quote. These are all from 2 Maccabees 7, and you can look this up, on the internets. But the youngest son says, "You will certainly not escape the hands of God, for we are suffering because of our own sins. And if our living Lord is angry for a little while to rebuke and discipline us, he will again be reconciled with his own servants. For our brothers, after enduring a brief suffering, have drunk of ever-flowing life under God's covenant. But you, by the judgment of God, will receive punishment for your arrogance. I, like my brothers, give up body and life for the laws of our ancestors, appealing to God to show mercy soon to our nation, and by trials and plagues to make you confess that he alone is God, and through me and my brothers to bring an end the wrath of the Almighty that has justly fallen on our whole nation." So, he understands that what's going on here is a result of corporate and communal sin. Also within the context of corporal and communal sin is his own sin, and that there is judgment, but because he is standing firm, and because he is seeking to hold fast to the laws of God, there is this hope of resurrection that is going to come, because it is by resurrection that God makes things right, that God sets the world to rights. So all these quotes are just clear statements of bodily resurrection. These are embodied ideas. Now we can look at other places. You have the Apocalypse of Moses, another one of these texts from the post-biblical time that tells the story of when Adam dies and what happened there, and how God sends the archangel Michael and says, "Hey, don't," says to Seth. And so Michael says to Seth, "Whatever you do, don't try to revive Adam. Let him go." And what happens then, kind of the climax of the story, is God calls to Adam's dead body and says, "I told you that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Now I promise to you the resurrection. I shall raise you on the last day in the resurrection with every man of your seed." So again, bodily resurrection was in the air. And then in the Psalms of Solomon that came from the 1st century BC, we see he writes this. The writer declares that the destruction of the sinner is forever, which is in contrast to those who fear the Lord shall rise up to eternal life, and their life shall be in the Lord's light, and it shall never end. This This is, again, bodily resurrection. And so what we see in this thread of bodily resurrection is two things. One, judgment has to come, because it is through judgment that that the wicked who have been getting away with all kinds of violence and evil, they get their judgment. They finally get their comeuppance by God. But on the other hand, those who have experienced the violence, those who have experienced being hurt and wounded and oppressed by the wicked, now find justice in the resurrection. So you see this, there's this turning of things, this flipping of events. And so how do we conclude this? How do we come to terms with these last 3 weeks? And in particular, how do we come to terms with what the Jewish people understood at the time of Jesus about what happens in life after death, and what happens with this issue of resurrection? Well, Wright and Bird, they summarize it this way. They say there's kind of two big things that we can hold with some degree of confidence regarding a historical understanding of the first century Second Temple Jewish position on these issues. The first is to understand that resurrection was in reference to the restoration of Israel. And so resurrection in this sense is a metaphor pointing towards the socio-political events and investing them with significance, that this would be an act of new creation, of covenant renewal. So through resurrection, what do we see happening? We see God renewing the covenant again. God again showing God's faithfulness to the covenant. This is what we see happening here. So there is this corporate sense, this metaphorical corporate sense of understanding resurrection. The second thing that we see with resurrection in Second Temple Judaism is that it is a reconstitution of dead human bodies into new bodily life. In other words, this was a literal bodily resurrection. This is a re-embodiment. Now, understanding that those two ideas are being held together, we need to see that they go hand in hand. They go together. Wright and Bird say it this way. Importantly, the two go together. Resurrection was about the restoration of Israel on the one hand, and the newly embodied life of all Yahweh's people on the other. This act of recreation was the great event that would bring the present age to a close and usher in the age to come. All of this was premised on the twin belief in Yahweh as both the creator and the God of justice. Without the goodness of creation, divine justice might remake humans in some different way. Without justice, the sorrows of the present creation would be unrelieved. Creation and justice go together. The martyrs would be raised. Israel as a whole would be vindicated. So when we see resurrection being talked about, when we see these ideas, Jesus saying, I am the resurrection and the life, when we see Paul say things like Jesus was raised for our justification, when in Revelation, Jesus says, I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. We are able to, these things become, they become more multicolored. They become more multifaceted. They become deeper, richer ideas as we connect them to this historical grounding of the people who were writing them, and the ideas and the things that they were coming out of. So we see now, as we move towards an understanding of Jesus's resurrection, we see that it is tied deeply to creation, to justice, and to God's faithfulness to covenant and God setting all things right. It's not just, oh, that's great, we get to go to heaven. No, it is so much more. It is in the resurrection that we find justice, that we find the groundings for justice, that we find the groundings for us to be able to look out at the world and say, we can rest in the sovereign and good God because we know there is a resurrection in which all things will be made right. So next week, where are we going? Well, next week, we are going to begin looking at the Apostle Paul. And we're going to look at the story of Easter through his writings. So we're going to get rolling. We're going to be all over the New Testament. We're going to take a look at 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians. We might get to Romans, and we'll see. We'll see how far we get here. But we're gonna begin working our way through these and taking a look at what Paul has to say. Now we're going to spend a lot of time in Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians, because it's there that in chapter 15 that we get Paul's fullest writing on the resurrection. So we're going to try to get through Romans next week, so then we can spend 1 week looking at 1 Corinthians, but I make no promises. So we will just see where we go. But after I've said all that and have now talked at you for 50 minutes, any questions, thoughts? What's pouncing? What is bouncing through your minds at this point?
I study at BSF, and we're studying Matthew.
Mm.
And I thought it was so interesting that we would have this discussion with you. And then in Matthew, where the Sadducees and the Pharisees asked Jesus for a sign. And he said, you have a sign, you have Jonah. And then my study had a little bit more interesting about the Jonah in the whale. And I thought that was so interesting that when you said that the resurrection was in the air, and it was, I think that was a big thought.
Yep.
And it was available for them if they wanted to check it out and study it or look, but they just ignored it.
Yep.
But Jesus told them, you did have a sign. You already had one, but of Jonah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love it how the Bible all fits together like that.
Isn't it amazing? The more we read it, the more we study it, the more we find these places of resonance, of echoes, of where we see all these little disparate threads begin to come together to make a beautiful tapestry of truth, right?
Right.
So yeah, good. Janet, Joanne, any thoughts, any closing thoughts or questions?
I had one that popped through my head, and I'm not sure if, as you kept talking, if my question is clear in my head. But when we say on Sunday the Apostles' Creed, and we say Jesus descended into hell,
mm-hmm.
and we've talked a lot about Hades here the last few weeks. So did Jesus descend into hell where people who are lost go, or did he go to Hades, which is where a bunch of souls are?
Yeah, I think it's a better understanding of connected back to this concept of Hades in the Old Testament, the place of the dead. I think that's the better understanding. I think when we say hell, I think when we're talking about hell in the Apostles' Creed, we're talking about this place of the dead, where these souls were waiting for bodily resurrection, and Jesus now shows up with the keys, right? The keys to Hades to unlock the gates and bring finally bring forth those who are waiting for bodily resurrection now can experience bodily resurrection because of Christ, because of his death, and because of his bodily resurrection. As the firstborn from the dead, he can now bring all those men and women with him and begin that process of setting all things right. So I think that's more what we're talking about there in the Apostles' Creed, as opposed to the place of the damned. So, yeah.
Okay. Place of the what?
The place of the damned.
Oh, well, I have just a question about Hades, I guess. It's
Yeah.
place of the dead. So what were the people doing there? I mean, they were just there? There was nothing happening?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the way that it gets talked about by Paul, he says, people have fallen asleep. So some theologians call it, historically have called it soul sleep. That there is just the sleeping of the souls until bodily resurrection occurs. Now, your mind can get a little bit warped here quick, because when you die, what do you enter into? You enter into eternity, right? So when you're in eternity, there's no sense of time. This idea of time, like we understand it, doesn't exist there. And so some theologian philosophers argue that when you die, you enter into eternity, you enter into this almost like a time warp for those of us that are still on earth of, now all things have been consummated. All things are made right. You are now bodily resurrected because you've kind of, in some sense, fast forwarded to the time of the new creation and the consummation of all things, right? But those of us that are still on earth, are still in time, are still thinking in terms of time and the passage of time. And so there's a lot of these kind of questions that kind of fit into the category of, how many angels dance on the head of a needle, where we can wrestle through them, and they're good. It's helpful. But I think, understanding the way Paul does it, hey, when we die, we go to, he says, we go to sleep. We die without, unlike unbelievers, he says, we do not die without hope. And so when people go to sleep before us, we have hope of the resurrection, and they die in that hope. And so from at least from our perspective, we will all experience this resurrection. So,
Well, that just totally confused me.
So if Jesus did go to, like you said, Hades, which is the place where souls are, and Paul says they are all asleep. When I was thinking of Jesus going to Hades, it's almost like he's going there to, everything's going to be okay. I'm here, I'm coming. But if they're asleep, are they, I know we don't know this, but are they aware of his being there?
I mean, I would think so. But, again, remember, when we talk about Jesus descending into Hades, descending to the place of the dead, we're talking about this before Paul writes, the idea of sleep, of soul sleep. So,
Right.
So we're also talking two different places on the timeline, in a sense of, you have the people kind of from the old, pre Christ's death. Now you have people post Christ's death. So, where are we at in that timeline? From our perspective, those who die now are sleeping, and they will eventually experience bodily resurrection. So
I'm still not getting this. So both my parents are dead. They have both died.
Mhm.
Are they sleeping somewhere, or are they in God's presence?
Yes.
Uh-huh. Well, I just think in the Old Testament, when was it the beggar that died, and
the rich man and Lazarus.
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So this is the crazy thing. This is where it gets wonky, right? Like, how do we understand eternity? How do we understand what happens when we die? Like, these are big, hard questions. And so, clearly we are not yet at the place of the second coming, right? Like, Jesus hasn't returned yet. We're God help me if this is the new creation. Because this stinks. And we got sold a bill of goods. So, like, we're clearly not in the new creation yet. We're clearly, there hasn't, the consummation of all things hasn't happened yet. We read in the New Testament that, those who died before the consummation of all things rise first, experience resurrection first. So it seems like, from our time-bound perspective, that people are sleeping. They're waiting for the resurrection. They're waiting for the second coming. However, that's our perspective, right? From our time-bound perspective, that's what Paul seems to teach. And I'm sure we will get more into that next week.
Okay, but I'm sorry, I have another question.
Yeah.
So what about the idea that when we die, we go to heaven?
Yeah, well, I and I think that's one of those interesting things, and it's one of those things where I don't know if this place called heaven that we think about is a place, which, because when we start doing this deep dive, and we actually start taking a look at what happens, what we see in Scripture is that the idea that we have of heaven really is the new creation. It really is the new heavens and the new earth. This thing that comes into existence at the second coming. So, what is it? So again, what does it mean for us to go? When we die, do we go to heaven? I think we do, in the sense that we're now in eternity. And so we don't experience time anymore. So it's like we're in this time warp when we die. We're in the future now of people who are still alive. And because we're not bound by time when we enter into eternity.
So are we seeing God?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, this is the thing, right? I think we are seeing, I think, from the perspective of those who have died, the consummation of all things has happened, and that they are experiencing resurrection, that they are in the presence of God in the new heavens and the new earth. From our perspective, as ones who are still living, they are asleep, and they are still waiting for this resurrection to occur. But this is where things get interesting with time, when we start talking about eternity, and we start talking about being outside. God is outside of time. God is not bound by time. And so this is why big, gigantic books on Christian philosophy and theology can still be written today, because we're going to continue to try to tease these things out and wrestle with these things and ask questions about how many angels dance on the head of a pin, because they're fascinating questions and they make our brains hurt. And so, but this is the other thing, is so much of our faith is both and. It's not either or. And so if we can try to, so we have to somehow come to grips with the both and. They are both asleep and they are fully in the presence of God in the new heavens and the new earth with us. Because when we die, which eventually we surely will, we will then also enter into eternity and experience the resurrection and the new heavens and the new earth, right? I mean, this is where it gets goofy. As one of my favorite science fiction characters, a guy named Doctor Who, says, or no, Doctor Who's also now a woman. But the doctor says, time is wibbly wobbly. And so, especially when we start talking about these questions of eternity, because we can't wrap our minds around eternity. We can't wrap our minds around eternity any more than we can wrap our minds around the idea of infinity, right? It's just too big. And so what we can think of is we can think in terms of our time boundedness right here, right now. And then we can think about what is going to come, this hope of resurrection that we have. And that we are looking towards and looking forward to. So I don't know if that's satisfying, but is it somewhat clarifying, or is it clear as mud?
I only have a million questions, but that's all right.
Yeah. Well, that's good.
Yeah,
that's good. The million questions is good, right? Like this.
I don't know if part of it is, we've built our answers to satisfy our earthly being. I mean, I think of my parents in heaven. I think of them being reunited with their parents and other family members that they love,
right?
And having fellowship with them, and that's just how I think of heaven. But
yeah, and that's absolutely true.
Okay,
but at the same time,
I guess the sleeping thing is the thing that I don't get.
Yeah.
Well, we do rest in peace.
Well, but we say, when I have always thought when the Bible says he went to sleep, it's just a euphemism for he died.
Yeah. And sometimes it is.
Yeah.
Right. But this is what Beyond Sunday School should do. It should raise a million questions in your mind. It should spark curiosity.
I don't want questions. I want the comfort of knowing.
I know, right? I know. And you know what, Joanne? I am growing more and more convinced that the opposite of faith is certainty. And so if we have certainty about all the things, then I wonder if we really have faith. Because if we are believing in a divine being that is outside of us, that we will never fully comprehend because of the divine, infinitude, then are we really worshiping the divine, or are we worshiping something that we've made ourselves?
Yeah.
Like what you just said, Dan. If we have certainty, then we don't have faith.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah.
And I think so often people think that doubt is the opposite of faith. I would argue that doubt is integral to faith. That if you don't have doubt,
I believe that. I do believe that.
Yeah.
I think it's normal.
If we don't have doubt,
then you're not sometimes. I mean, sometimes you can't help but say, really?
Yeah. We should come to a point, if we are truly seeking out the God of the universe, there should come a point where we throw up our hands and say, thou knowest, right? Thou knowest. I don't, but thou knowest, because at some point, that's all we've got. It's kind of like the Trinity. I mean, we don't know how the Trinity works. We don't know how it is. We just know that it is. We see the evidence of this reality of a triune God. How does that work? Anyone that says they know how it works is probably a heretic. Because, eventually all of our conceptions of how a triune God works, of how that actually plays itself out, they fall apart. Because we can't wrap our minds around something like that. And so there will always come a place in our pursuit of God where we declare thou knowest, because we certainly don't. So.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. Welcome to Beyond Sunday School with Pastor Dan. Leaves you with more questions than answers.
That's for sure.
Well, All right, gang, for those of you that are watching this online or listening to this later, I hope that you have a million questions. And you know how to reach me on just about any major social media platform. Feel free to send me a message with any questions that you have. And or if you want to set up a time to meet and talk over coffee or an adult beverage or some sort, let me know, and would be happy to sit down and talk and walk through as many questions as we can together. If you want to be in the Zoom room, again, reach out to me on any social media platform. Let me know, and I will get you the link to the Beyond Sunday School Zoom room so you too can be a part of the live recording and streaming and asking questions. But until next week, love well.